Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very last installment of IR in Focus for 2023. I am your host, Carmen Lilly, and today I'm joined by my esteemed colleague from Sustainable1, Lindsey Hall. In the next 20 minutes, we'll walk through lessons from COP28 and take a look at what could be in store for 2024 when it comes to sustainability trends and transparency. Welcome, Lindsey.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I'm a little nervous to be here. I got to be honest. I'm so used to being on the other side of this equation, being the one asking the questions. So thank you for having me.
Oh, I'd love to have you on. I'm sure this will be a great discussion. Now, before we get started, I'd love to formally introduce you to our listeners. Lindsey Hall is head of ESG thought leadership at S&P Global Sustainable1, where she co-hosts the ESG Insider podcast and is a member of S&P Global's Research Council. I'm very excited to have you and your expertise on here. You've been doing a lot of great things in the space when it comes to raising awareness to sustainability trends and how we should really be thinking about sustainability in its future. Let's start broadly before we get into some predictions and what 2024 could have in store. I'd love to begin with your thoughts on COP28 and some of the themes and topics that stood out to pay closer attention to in the new year.
Sure. I don't know how much your listeners are familiar with or have been living and breathing COP28 like I have been this past month. I'll just give a quick little intro. COP28 is the Conference of the Parties. It's the annual climate change conference that the UN hosts each year in a different location. This year it took place in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Over the course of 2 weeks, it brought together tens of thousands of stakeholders from government, the private sector, nonprofits, really from just a huge range of stakeholders. They all convened in Dubai to talk about some of the big thorny issues that are facing the world in terms of the climate crisis and what are the solutions to that climate crisis. That's just a little bit of scene setting. Tell me, Carmen, what would you like to hear?
Is there anything that kind of stood out to you this year as having a little bit more attention and focus? Like you mentioned, really large and high level, big issues that as a conglomerate of countries and representatives and leaders in this space, how do we deal and how do we manage potential climate crisis? From your perspective, what was new-ish in terms of, hey, we need to pay a little bit more attention to this specific area?
Absolutely. One of the big outcomes this year was that it brought about the first ever Global Stocktake. The Global Stocktake is basically a process for countries and stakeholders to assess their progress toward meeting the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. And the Paris Agreement was agreed at a previous COP with the overarching goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. So it's a pretty lofty goal that there's widespread consensus that we're not currently on track to meet that. And this Global Stocktake brought together all these delegates from different countries around the world, where they ultimately, after 2 weeks of hashing it out, agreed on text that outlines what's the direction of travel to transition away from fossil fuels toward the phase down of unabated coal. Pretty important messaging as it relates to the future of the energy transition. This is agreed by countries, by government delegates, but it has a lot of implications for the private sector as well. So Global Stocktake is one big outcome of COP28. Another interesting thing was just the private sector presence. For your listeners, I think this is a reason why do we pay attention to COP28? We pay attention in the private sector because so many companies are now showing up to this gathering, and they're taking part in all of these different conversations with other members of their industry, having these cross-industry conversations. To give one example, I moderated a panel discussion hosted by IBM, and the other panelist along with IBM was the CEO and co-founder of the nonprofit water.org. We're seeing a lot of this cross-pollination across different stakeholder groups. This year, the private sector presence was just so much bigger than it has been at any past COP. That was another important takeaway potentially for your audience. And then I guess one other thing that stood out to me is this is a climate COP. It's the annual climate change focused conference that the UN hosts. But at this COP, there was a much bigger presence or discussion around nature and biodiversity loss. There's sort of this rising understanding that you can't address the climate crisis if you're not also addressing the biodiversity loss crisis. We're going to be paying more attention to, I think, heading into 2024. Not to get too into the weeds on UN process here, but in addition to the annual climate change focused COP that we've just been talking about, there's also a biannual biodiversity focused COP. And so the next one of those is going to be happening at the end of 2024. So we're going to have this big runway to talk more about nature.
I appreciate you making this distinction between the different COPs, because when I was prepping for this conversation, I was doing a lot of Googling and like COP28. And they're like, well, do you mean like this one that was in Toronto, which was biodiversity focused? There was a bunch of different events. I get these events, it's pulling everyone together, but sometimes there are a little bit more isolated focus, whether it be climate or biodiversity or energy transition or whatever it may be. So that's good to know. Unpacking the biodiversity piece a little bit more, I think that's really interesting. I came across research by the World Economic Forum, and this is from 2022, but still it's pretty relevant to this conversation. It suggested that an estimated 44 trillion, and again, highlighting the estimated because that's a huge number, right? 44 trillion of global value generation, which is more than half of the world's GDP, comes from industries that are highly or moderately dependent on nature. This is where biodiversity comes in. So that's what we're talking about in terms of huge, grand numbers of what could be at risk. On the flip side, in a very similar report, they said that when we think about opportunities, it suggests that companies that develop nature positive solutions to protect biodiversity have a potential to create 10 trillion in business opportunities and 395 million jobs by 2030. Again, these are just like huge numbers. Those are very hard to really wrap your head around. To make it a little bit more tangible for our listeners, I'd like to pick your brain and thoughts on when we think about biodiversity and you think about this topic, help connect why corporations should really care about biodiversity.
Yeah, I think this is an active discussion that a lot of us in the sustainability space are having right now. Like, how do you put dollar figures behind the impacts and dependencies that businesses have on nature? Because right now, I think there is a tendency for a lot of businesses to think about nature as this sort of separate thing outside of them. And the discussion that I've been hearing, for example, at COP15 in Montreal, which took place in December 2022, this discussion about the fact that no, nature is not something that is outside of you, separate, optional. It's actually, many businesses are completely dependent on nature. Many businesses are highly dependent on water. Many businesses are highly dependent on all these different ecosystem services that we don't historically have a great way of valuing. And to that $44 trillion number that you cited, there was actually a new analysis that PwC, the consulting firm, released in April 2023 that updated that figure. And it found that 55% of global GDP, equivalent to an estimated $58 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. And so I think the place that we're at as a business community right now is trying to wrap our heads around that and trying to figure out, okay, how exactly do you as a business measure these things, right? We have this common refrain in the sustainability space: you can't manage what you don't measure. That's why some of the developments that we've seen over the past year have been really important. For example, we had final recommendations come out from the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. And I'll try not to throw out too many acronyms in this conversation, but the TNFD has been a big one. And we heard this come up a lot at COP28 as well. So essentially what the TNFD does is create a voluntary framework for companies that they can use to assess their nature-related risks and opportunities. And if you've been following the sustainability space, then this might sound familiar. You might have heard of the predecessor, the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This is a really well-established framework for companies to think about and disclose on their climate-related risks. And so just in 2023, we've had the final recommendations now from this newer organization, the TNFD. And so I think this evolution from TCFD to TNFD kind of speaks to the broader evolution we're seeing as companies move from understanding, assessing, and reporting on their climate related risks and now to getting their heads around the nature piece of that as well.
I was reading about the TNFD as well, and it seemed like, and not just with the TNFD, but I think to your point, our conversations around sustainability in general is moving less from a stick perspective, like poking people, you have to do this, look at your risk, but framing it more in a sense of like, there are opportunities here to do good, which, or if they're financial opportunities, not only will help your corporation, your company, but it will help the ecosystem that you live and operate in as well. So I thought that was interesting to see a maturity almost in the conversation going from, hey, you have to think about this from a risk perspective and you're going to have regulations, you're going to have to report on blah, 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 to, hey, as a corporation, as a well managed corporation, you need to be capitalizing on the opportunities here. I thought that was interesting. To your point around measuring, so measuring those financial flows and moving that towards nature positive outcomes. Did you get that same kind of sense coming out from COP28, like a little bit more like optimistic around we're moving forward or we're moving forward like positively?
I think that's a good question. I was trying to, after the fact, summarize all of the different things that I heard. And where I landed was that there was this overarching sense of optimism, but that was also balanced by frustration about the pace of progress. To say a little bit more about what I mean, okay, so there was frustration that the incremental pace of change doesn't meet the urgency of the climate crisis. And that was also mixed with this huge energy and optimism. People who had traveled, in many cases, a very long distance to get to Dubai and take part in these conversations. And they're not doing that for no reason. They're doing that because either they believe in the mission of helping solve for climate change, or also because they see those opportunities. You know, I talked to a lot of people from a lot of different industries, and I asked a lot of them, what are you doing here? Why are you at COP? Why is your bank here at COP28? And a lot of the answers that I got were, well, because we see that opportunity that you're talking about, Carmen. We also heard that they want to learn from best practices of others in the industry. They want to come and see who can they talk to and what best practices are their peers having that maybe they can take away, take back to their companies and their stakeholders back home. So I guess it's sort of a mixed bag, I would say.
I could definitely see how some of those conversations around progress and the pace of progress could be frustrating. I feel like, especially folks, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, but especially with folks that have been in the space for a while, who've been like the bullhorn, hey, this is important. Hey, this is important. We need to do something. Hey, we need to do something. They've been talking about it a long time. So I can see how once you finally get global leaders and industry leaders on board, like how slow the progress might be to move everybody and shift everybody forward.
One kind of interesting anecdotal example that I got to witness was S&P Global hosted this event on December 3rd called Advancing the Transition in Dubai. I got to MC that event, and you had a couple hundred people in the audience. And at one point I did this informal audience poll, and I said, who's optimistic that this COP gathering is going to result in meaningful progress toward the energy transition? I didn't know what to expect, but almost every single person in that room raised their hand. So that's just like a little bit of an informal temperature taking, I guess you could say. And then another kind of quote that stood out to me in my interviews is I sat down with the chief sustainability officer of GM, the big General Motors automotive company. And she said to me, we're past the point where we're making all these big, bold goals and announcements. Now it's about what are the building blocks and the steps that we can take toward making progress. So that quote just speaks to like the need to move from high level goals to actual like concrete steps that you're taking and real solutions.
Exactly. It kind of ties back to just human behavior. I did read that when you make and set personal goals, you don't like announce them because you get that dopamine hit and that feeling that you did accomplish them when you like start telling people, yeah, I'm going to do this. Here's my New Year resolutions. And you kind of lose like momentum on that. So I can see how that can ladder up to a large corporation. Maybe you shouldn't be going out and touting, hey, yeah, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And maybe just get down to actually doing X, Y, and Z and then announcing it, right? To get that positive reinforcement and feedback. That's interesting how that's playing out in COP28 too.
So, Carmen, one thing that is interesting is that although we do have all of this like energy and enthusiasm, it's pretty clear that there's been some progress, but the world is not on track to meet Paris Agreement goals. That's something that came out of the Stocktake. And we saw sections in the Stocktake on mitigation, on adaptation, on loss and damage. Overall, this Global Stocktake recognized the need for deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in order to get on track for Paris Agreement goals. It also called on countries to contribute to several different mitigation efforts, which it outlines in detail. And it updated the global goal for adaptation, which is part of the Paris Agreement. It calls for parties to update their assessments of climate risks and exposures by 2030 to inform national adaptation plans and make progress by 2030. All that is just to say that there's a lot more that needs to happen. I heard widespread recognition that the physical risks that climate change poses, the cost that it will pose to companies and countries without adaptation is pretty huge. This is something that we've worked to quantify in some of the new research that we published ahead of COP28 in our special edition of the S&P Global Sustainability Quarterly. There was also this widespread recognition of just the cost of blunting the damage caused by climate change. And that's in particular true for developing countries. So the Stocktake highlighted that the adaptation finance needs of developing countries are estimated between $215 billion and up to $387 billion annually up until 2030. And just to throw another big number at your listeners, Carmen, the Stocktake said that about $4.3 trillion per year need to be invested in clean energy until 2030. So just massive amount of climate finance needed. And we heard repeatedly at COP28 that both the public and the private sector will play a pivotal role in addressing this massive climate financing gap, which again, I think just speaks to your audience about like, why is this something we need to be paying attention to?
I often like to think about sustainability with carrots and sticks. I believe a lot of sticks have been pulled in terms of like upcoming regulations. And then you have a lot of organizations out there. You have BlackRock, like you have other like global asset managers saying that they won't support folks with high exposure to these biodiversity related risks. So off of BMO's Global Asset Management website, they explicitly said this. They withheld their support from board of directors at international companies with high exposure to biodiversity related risks, and also who did not have sufficient strategies for reducing contributions to nature loss. You have organizations now still poking with sticks, but I think what the focus is and what people should really hone in on, like what are the carrots out there? So like talking about climate finance, there's going to be huge amounts of money, like trillions of dollars, like going and making financing available for folks who are strengthening sustainable development goals, for example. Let's just unpack that a little bit more about climate finance, the framework, what was agreed upon, what money needs to be thrown at this in order to move us forward as a society.
I think it involves a lot of different stakeholders. So there's not necessarily like one central thing that was agreed, but COP28 came out with this climate finance commitment counter, which I've been keeping an eye on. And some of the numbers are pretty impressive or surprising. So over $85 billion committed so far as of the end of COP mid-December. And $6.8 billion of that was for energy. $61.8 billion of that was toward finance. $8.7 billion toward lives and livelihood, and the list goes on. Part of what's complicated here is that, as I mentioned earlier, the solutions are going to come from different places. They're going to come from different stakeholders in both the private and the public sector. In some instances, public policy is going to enable some of that financing. To give you an example, S&P Global Commodity Insights released some data showing that the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is a comprehensive energy and climate law passed in 2022, has already prompted more than $267 billion in new investments, as well as more than $400 billion in announced commitments from the private sector. So that's just on the back of one climate policy or climate law. To give you another example or another quote that I heard at COP28, I sat down and talked with Hong Patterson, the CFO and COO of the Green Climate Fund. She said there's a huge pool of funding that's waiting from the private sector, and it's a function of trying to figure out how we can help them overcome the hurdles. So, to walk that back a little bit, what I hear a lot is this discussion of, on the one hand, the private sector has all this money that they want to invest in climate solutions, in some of these big, challenging, thorny problems. And on the other hand, we just don't have like a great way to get that money where it needs to go. So we have need on the one hand, we have money that's ready, willing, and able on the other, but connecting those dots can sometimes be a challenge. And that's a recurring theme that I hear. And I thought it was notable coming from this particular interviewee that I spoke to, because the Green Climate Fund is the largest climate-focused fund globally, and it's the main mechanism for financing the Paris Agreement. I'll pause there, but this climate finance thing is such an important topic, and it's something we're going to be talking about a lot more heading into 2024.
So the climate finance gap was something that was identified, talked about, and hopefully we see more solutions rolling out on how to connect those dots in 2024.
Yeah, and just to give you another example of something I heard on the sidelines of COP, I sat down with a woman named Dame Susan Rice. She's had this illustrious career in banking, former chief executive and chair of Lloyd's TSB Scotland, former managing director of Lloyd's Banking Group, former non-executive director of the Bank of England, and now she's chairing the global steering group of a group called GEFI. It's the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, which is a nonprofit focused on working with the financial sector to deliver finance to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And so she said to me, which is similar to what I just kind of quoted you from Hong, is she said, I hear all the time there's a lot of money out there, but it can't actually get to the other side. What Dame Susan said is that creative hybrid solutions have a role to play in sort of getting companies, organizations, investors, bankers comfortable with the risk that comes with some of these investments, and then finding these like creative but sound and prudent solutions to get that money working together and to get those stakeholders together who maybe haven't worked together in the past.
Right. Just making sure that all the parties are coming to the table and agreeing on how to get the money, first of all, and then how to use and spend the money to the best benefit.
Right.
It's a big problem. I don't know. Again, we've started talking about how there's this swell of optimism, but now that I'm digging into it a little bit more, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed about it all. These are huge issues. I love talking about these big theoretical issues, but I think where rubber hits the road is when they come into play and they come into practice by corporations and governments and leadership. So just to get another temperature check from you, thinking about 2024, where you want to spend your time and where you want to focus, whether it be topics or digging into certain climate or biodiversity risk, where's your head at when you think about 2024 and where you would want to spend your time?
I think we've touched on some of them already. It's how do we move beyond just lofty goals to what is the actual roadmap to get to those goals? So I think that's something I'm going to be pushing for in all of my conversations. And whenever I'm interviewing someone for the ESG Insider podcast and they kind of give me a lofty statement, I'm like, okay, but can we walk it back and can you put that into concrete terms? What might that look like in action for our listeners? So that's one overarching idea. But then in terms of the thematics that I'm going to be focused on, it's definitely going to be this continued focus on climate finance. Where does the money come from? How is the private sector and the public sector working together? We're a little more than a year into the US Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. Like I mentioned, that's already resulted in some pretty big investments from the private sector. That has also spurred some policy moves in other parts of the world, like in the EU. So I'm really just going to be watching with a lot of interest to see what kind of policy developments we see in the year ahead. And then also definitely going to be watching to see the development of standards. We talked a little bit about the TNFD framework and how that is helping companies get their heads around biodiversity related, nature related risks and dependencies. Another thing we heard about a lot in 2023 that we'll be talking about a lot in 2024 is the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, over the summer of 2023 issued its first two sustainability standards. And now they're looking at what's the next steps. Where do we focus next? And these are really significant because it's creating this global standardization around sustainability that can hopefully help decrease some of the fragmentation we've seen. And then there'll continue to be country level rules, regulations that roll out that we'll be watching with interest in the US. As you know, we're still waiting on the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC's climate disclosure rule. That's been bumped back a couple of times. I know a lot of companies are waiting with bated breath to see what that ultimately looks like. Those are a couple of things on my list, although it's a pretty long list. I don't want to take too much of your time.
No, it's great. Here comes the hard part. I love to close out these podcasts with just something that is very short, sweet, intangible. I do appreciate that a lot of this, when we talk about in theory, is hard to kind of wrap your arms around. But just to break it down for our listeners, what is one thing you would like our listeners to walk away with when thinking about sustainability in 2024?
If this is not a cop out, I'm going to cite a quote that I heard from Schneider Electric's chairman when he gave a keynote speech at that S&P Global event that happened in Dubai on December 3rd. I think it was so nice and pithy. He said, "There's no excuse for any company not to go to net zero. There's no time to lose because the reality that's a bit frustrating is that 70% of the technologies to go net zero are already existing." And so the reason I bring up that quote is because it synthesizes this broader idea that I've heard a lot in the sustainability space, is that although the challenges we're facing, as you mentioned, Carmen, are daunting, a lot of the solutions already exist. A lot of the technologies already exist. A lot of the money is out there, ready, willing, and able. It's just we need to do the hard work of connecting the dots. I would leave your listeners with that somewhat hopeful note to end the year.
Excellent. Thank you. I do love that. And it's definitely not a cop out to refer to someone else's advice and expertise. I love it. I do that all the time as well. I'm like, well, this person said it best. Well, thank you so much, Lindsey, for your time. I have thoroughly enjoyed this discussion and conversation with you. And for our listeners, that is a wrap for 2023. Thank you, as always, for your support. And thank you to our expert today, Lindsey Hall, for your time. I hope all of you have a great rest of your year and happy holidays.